Tonight, President Biden's stark admission about the future of his agenda and signaling he believes Russia will invade Ukraine. In a rare solo news conference, the president acknowledging Americans' frustrations on the latest COVID surge, historic inflation, and his delayed agenda. Also, what he said when pressed about a voting rights bill stalled by members of his own party. And on the showdown in Ukraine, the president saying at one point Vladimir Putin will, quote, move in. Our White House team with the new statement just released on Ukraine, plus Chuck Todd moments away. Also tonight, the new accusations against former President Trump and two of his children. New York's Attorney General says an investigation into Trump and his businesses found, quote, significant evidence suggesting fraud. Could this turn into a criminal probe? And breaking right now, the Supreme Court rejecting Trump's effort to stop the National Archives from giving the January 6th House Committee hundreds of pages of documents from his time in office. Cities on edge, the new surveillance video showing the suspect wanted for stabbing a 24-year-old graduate student to death while she was alone at work. The victim texting one of her friends saying she had a bad feeling about him just moments before the killing. And on the opposite coast, two other women killed in random and horrific attacks. The school shootings in two states, a manhunt tonight after a 15-year-old was shot on a school van that was parked outside of a Pittsburgh high school. And in Florida, a teenager shot 3 times by a classmate. Britney's battles, the pop star filing a new motion against her father, Jamie Spears, claiming he took tens of millions of dollars from her. Plus, the cease and desist letter just sent to her famous little sister. And surviving a bear attack. New video showing a Florida woman after a black bear chased her down while she walked her dog. How she managed to escape its claws. Top story starts right now. And good evening. We begin Top Story tonight with President Biden defending his first year in office as it comes to a close. In a rare solo news conference, the president saying he believes he, quote, outperformed expectations, but acknowledged several challenges, including another COVID surge, record inflation, and his stalled agenda. The president saying the country has made what he called enormous pandemic progress, including 200 million Americans vaccinated since his inauguration, but did admit his administration could have done more to increase testing ahead of this latest wave in cases. The president also calling on the Federal Reserve and a deeply divided Congress to help fight inflation, now a reminder at a near 40-year high. He's also facing a major foreign policy test as his White House warns Russia could invade Ukraine at any moment. Today, the president warning that would be a, quote, disaster for Vladimir Putin. And tonight, his White House seeming to clean up some of his remarks that signaled his belief Putin will invade. We have a team of reporters tonight, including Kristen Welker and Chuck Todd standing by. So let's begin with NBC's Kelly O'Donnell leading us off tonight from the White House.
Tonight, President Biden struggling with soaring inflation, a stalled agenda, and sinking approval ratings is searching for a reset. In his first solo White House news conference in nearly a year, the president pointing to the pandemic.
Still, for all this progress, I know there's a lot of frustration and fatigue in this country. And we know why. COVID-19.
The president touting more than 200 million Americans fully vaccinated. But COVID is still surging despite this campaign pledge.
I'm going to shut down the virus, not the country.
Just this week, some Democratic senators calling out the president for failing to take more significant steps earlier to increase testing.
Should we have done more testing earlier? Yes. But we're doing more now. Some people may call what's happening now the new normal. I call it a job not yet finished. It will get better.
On inflation at a 40-year high, with prices soaring on everything from gasoline to groceries, the president again touted his massive social spending and climate bill.
The bottom line, if price increases are what you're worried about, the best answer is my Build Back Better plan.
But that legislation has stalled. So has Democrats' voting rights legislation. President Biden unable to get his own party on board. Still, the president is blaming Republicans.
I did not anticipate that there'd be such a stalwart effort to make sure that the most important thing was that President Biden didn't get anything done. Think about this. What are Republicans for? What are they for?
He was asked about the impact if Democrats' voting bills fail.
Speaking of voting rights legislation, if this isn't passed, do you still believe the upcoming election will be fairly conducted and its results will be legitimate?
Well, it all depends on whether or not we're able to make the case to the American people that some of this is being set up to try to alter the outcome of the election. I think if, in fact, no matter how hard they make it for minorities to vote, I think you're going to see them willing to stand in line and defy the attempt to keep them from being able to vote.
NBC's Kristen Welker asked the president about African-American voters who told us they're disappointed in him.
I spoke to a number of black voters who fought to get you elected. They see this push on voting rights more as a last-minute PR push than it is a legitimate effort to get legislation passed. So what do you say to these black voters who say that you do not have their backs, as you promised on the campaign trail?
I've had their back. I've had their back my entire career. I've never not had their back. The fact is that there's a timing that is not of one's own choice. It's somewhat dictated by events that are happening in country.
And asked about the president's promise to unify the country, with criticism of this recent speech where he blamed Americans who disagreed with Democrats' voting bills.
Do you want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace? Do you want to be on the side of John Lewis or Bull Connor? Do you want to be on the side of Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis?
I did not say that they were going to be a George Wallace or a Bull Connor. I said we're going to have a decision in history.
Is the country more unified than when you first took office?
Based on some of the stuff we've got done, I'd say yes, but it's not nearly unified as it should be.
Okay, that was Kelly O'Donnell reporting for us. Kelly, we thank you. We now turn to Chief White House correspondent Kristen Welker, who was in the East Room during that news conference, as we just saw. She joins Top Story now. Kristen, the president also made a number of headlines, including on his social spending plan, and it sounds like the strategy going forward is to chop parts of it up?
That's exactly right, Tom. The president said he expects to break up that bill into smaller pieces. So what does that mean? Well, it's pretty significant. It means that some elements like the child tax credit, free community college may be dropped. And there was another headline about Vice President Harris. As you know, she's gotten some criticism recently. I asked if he would commit to keeping her on his ticket in 2024, and he said yes.
Yeah, that was a major moment, no doubt. I know you also asked about Ukraine, and the White House has just put out a statement moments ago seeming to clean up some of the president's remarks surrounding Ukraine. What can you tell our viewers?
Well, the president, Tom, seemed to indicate initially that he had assessed that it was likely that President Putin would, quote, move in to Ukraine, and that if it were a small incursion, there may be some way to tolerate such a move. So just moments ago, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki put out a statement. Let me read you a piece of it. She said President Biden has been clear with the Russian president. If any Russian military forces move across the Ukrainian border, that's a renewed invasion, and it will be met with a swift, severe, and unified response from the United States and our allies. Her clarification comes after some Republicans and even some Democrats have criticized the president for that language, saying that that could be a green light to President Putin at a really critical moment, Tom.
All right, Kristen Welker with all the breaking news coming out of the White House tonight. Kristen, thank you. For more analysis now on the president's marathon news conference, NBC News political director Chuck Todd joins us now. He's also moderator of Meet the Press. Chuck, look, you've seen a lot of these. There was a question there about the competence of the Biden administration. It was focused on the pullout of Afghanistan and the 5G debacle. But I want to ask you big picture as well. How do you think the president handled this news conference?
Look, I think generally it's a good thing. I think it went about a half hour too long. I think the last 30 minutes wasn't good for anybody. Didn't make the press score look so good, and it wasn't his best moments. But I thought that first hour, really the meat part of this press conference. Look, it felt like I'm here in Georgia right now, sort of getting, we're on the 1-year anniversary. Georgia is the state in some ways that gave Biden the opportunity to have a big agenda in his first 2 years in office. And talking to some voters down here, I found 3 voters who I spoke with earlier today about that were what I call new Biden voters. They didn't vote for any Democrat. One even voted for Trump in 2016. and they voted for Biden in 20, and all of them talked more about the cost of goods, COVID, kids in schools. The point is this. The president sounded like somebody who's been watching these focus groups now, who has, even though he said he doesn't believe the polls, that he's been reading the polls, because this felt like a guy who was talking to the middle of the electorate. He sounded more like the pragmatic candidate Biden that we heard a lot more of. He spent time distinguishing himself from who's really a liberal, like Bernie Sanders, trying to say, I think twice he referred to himself as a capitalist, almost trying to once again sort of shift a little bit more and speak to that vast middle. Doesn't always mean ideologically centered, but that middle of the electorate that is looking to government to help them with their problems, not looking for a larger ideological shift. So I do think overall this press conference served him well, because as a reporter, I could say this, I at least have a better idea of why. And I think there's a lot of voters out there wondering, well, why didn't you push voting rights first? Why did you do this? He at least offered an explanation. You may not agree with it, but he sounded more unfiltered. He sounded less talking pointish. So I think in the moment he's in right now politically, Tom, I think it could be very effective. But I'll tell you this, he shouldn't wait 10 months. I think these almost like fireside chat explanations, right? He's not a good soundbite guy, but he is a good long talker. I actually think they serve him well explaining his rationales for why he's doing things. But he needs to spend, he admits it himself, he's got to get out more. He needs to spend more time talking to voters rather than talking to a handful of senators on his airplane or behind the scenes in the U.S. Congress.
And you're in a state like Georgia, because we may be talking about Georgia like we used to talk about states like Ohio and Florida, because so much is changing there and there's such a power dynamic. But I got to ask you, because now I'm a little confused. You were talking about that President Biden was sort of hitting the points that the voters you were talking to cared about. So he may be listening to these focus groups. At the same time, on his legislative calendar, on his agenda, he's talking about Build Back Better, maybe trying to get it in chunks, and voting rights. But it sounds like what you're hearing from Americans, there are other priorities on the table.
Well, there are, and that's why if he breaks up Build Back Better and says, hey, I'm here to save you money on your child care costs, well, that's different. That's a different sales pitch, right, than Build Back Better, hey, we're trying to build everything back, and oh, by the way, we're going to make it climate resilient, and oh, by the way, it's going to be the most equitable thing we've ever done. You know, I do think voters were overwhelmed by that, but if you narrowly start to do these things piecemeal, I actually think voters will see what you're doing better. There'll be more transparency in what you're trying to do. So I actually think in some ways breaking it up is going to be an easier time to get support for it. And again, I go back to where voters are. If you care about pre-K, you care about some of these things, you could probably get voter support right now, because the COVID and the school closures sort of ripped that Band-Aid off, and a lot of people realize how much they depended on the schools, not just to educate their children, but to watch their kids while they earned a living.
You know, Chuck, we'll have to wait and see how the news digests that news conference. But for me, just watching this, I thought the biggest headline was when he was talking about Ukraine. And he's already getting some heat for his remarks about President Putin, saying that he essentially expects him to move in. Did he just give Putin a green light to move into Ukraine, to invade another country?
Yeah, look, I thought kudos, by the way, for the press corps actually listening to the answers that other reporters asked. You know, I've always thought a lot of times reporters are a bit too egotistical to admit somebody asked a good question. Because the follow-up on this was important, because here's what I learned from that answer, Tom. The problem is the Europeans are not united on this. And what he's basically saying is, I'm not punishing Russia as much as I'd like to, because I don't have everybody in NATO on board. And he didn't say it that explicitly, but for those of us that have been reporting out this story, this is the problem that they've had in trying to get tough on Russia. Trust me, this country, if they could have stopped that Nord Stream pipeline, would have. But Germany won't allow it. And there's other European countries that are nervous about their financial and energy relationships with Russia. So I do think what he did was reveal, this is why I say I really like this press conference, he revealed what we had sort of been hearing and getting on background, which is, we don't have unanimity here on how to confront Russia if it's not a full invasion. And that, I think, is troubling. He may have needed to be more explicit, because you're right. That does come across as it sounding like he's saying, well, we may not have to do much if there's a small incursion. I am surprised he didn't publicly want to put a little more pressure on the Europeans on that front. Maybe he's playing a little good cop right now. But that to me is what I took away from his explanation to what he meant by that. Europeans are not united with us on how to confront Russia. That's the bottom line.
All right, Chuck Todd for us tonight. Chuck, we thank you for that. Staying on Russia, the president predicting a Russian invasion and saying the United States would not take drastic action if Russia's invasion is, quote, minor. NBC's chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel has the details.
Even as U.S. officials warn Russia now has enough troops in position to invade Ukraine, President Biden today appeared to suggest if Russia does a partial incursion, the U.S. could live with it.
Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, et cetera. But if they actually do what they're capable of doing with the force amassed on the border, it is going to be a disaster for Russia.
President Biden warned a significant Russian invasion, a massive operation, would trigger devastating economic consequences.
If they invade, they're going to pay. They're not going, their banks will not be able to deal in dollars.
But even when pressed, President Biden repeated that he sees a difference between a small and big military incursion in Ukraine and that he expects one.
My guess is he will move in. He has to do something.
All right, Richard Engel joins us now live from London. Richard, so I do want to ask you tonight, what happened there? Because if you were listening to what the president said and his tone, if you're a Ukrainian troop who is looking at a Russian troop across the border, there is nothing nonchalant about this. There's nothing minor about this. And by saying, you know, Putin will move in, it almost seemed like it was going to happen.
Well, if you're a Ukrainian troop on one of those border positions, I can tell you, you're going to be hearing President Biden. You're not going to be reading the clarification from Jen Psaki when the first line of that clarification says President Biden was very clear about U.S. policy. President Biden has not been clear. Over the last several days, even earlier today, you had the Secretary of State, U.S. State Department officials, European officials, you had the head Secretary General of NATO, all warning Russia not to take a military action, that there would be some devastating consequences, that Europe was united. Now, are there divisions behind the scenes? Undoubtedly. Are there doubts? Undoubtedly. But then to hear them laid out as Russia is now trying to weigh the balance here, trying to, as Vladimir Putin is looking at the options in front of him and deciding, should he cross that border? And if so, what are the consequences? Well, he just heard directly from President Biden saying, well, if he crosses a little bit and doesn't go too far, then the consequences might not be that severe because there's divisions over it. And there is only one place that we can be talking about. Let's be very clear, because some people have been thinking about this in sort of black and white terms from the beginning. Russia has about 100,000 troops positioned on three sides of the borders. Russia also has troops inside Belarus. There was a concern that Russia might have to hold off this operation because of the uprising in Kazakhstan, because Kazakhstan is also a bordering country with Russia. And a lot of the troops that are on the border with Ukraine were pulled off the border from Kazakhstan. And there was a concern maybe they would have to go back to their original position. But that uprising in Kazakhstan went away. So you have this massive amount of firepower around the Ukrainian territory. But also within Ukraine, and this is the ambiguous part that I think is really important in all of this, there are already two enclaves, Donetsk and Luhansk, where pro-Russian separatists already hold territory. Now, when President Biden said, if Russia launches an invasion and there's debate about whether it was an invasion, whether it was an incursion or not, it could only be in those areas where Russia already has an undeclared presence. That is extremely, here in Ukraine, it is an extremely, extremely sensitive issue, and they will read these comments by President Biden tonight as effectively ceding those areas, ceding those little pieces that are already more or less controlled by Russia and pro-Russian forces,
Richard,
and saying that he doesn't mind that much.
On that point, and just a quick correction, you're clearly in Ukraine tonight. On that point, I mean, you've spent a lot of time with these troops in Ukraine. How do you think those comments are going to affect those soldiers that are out there that essentially may be fighting for their life soon?
Sorry, I didn't. If I said I wasn't in Ukraine, yes, I'm in Kiev right now. The soldiers, I think right now there's a deeper concern that some sort of conflict with Russia is more likely now than it was before. President Biden just said that he expects it to happen. So when you say you expect it to happen, and President Biden's coming out and saying he's expected to happen, why shouldn't the soldiers who are on the front lines also start to think that it could happen? Many of the soldiers who I spoke to in those trenches believed, well, it won't happen. The U.S. has our back. This is just Vladimir Putin's saber rattling, that Russia's just threatening, but they would never do something. For them to hear that President Biden himself thinks it's going to happen, well, could very easily change their mindset.
Richard Engel reporting from Ukraine for Top Story tonight. Richard, thank you. And this just in, we're following some late-breaking news out of Washington. It appears the Supreme Court is denying former President Trump's request to block documents from being turned over to the Congressional Committee investigating the January 6th riot at the Capitol. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Leanne Caldwell joins us now for more. Leanne, so break this down for us. What exactly do we know, and what does this ruling mean for the former president?
Good evening, Tom. So this is a big win for the January 6th Select Committee and a big loss for the former president. What happened tonight is that the Supreme Court said that 700 pages of documents that the former president tried to prevent from getting turned over to the January 6th Select Committee. Now, these are documents that were with him in the White House that went over to the National Archives. Well, the Supreme Court says that they can get turned over to the committee, and just one justice disagreed. That was Clarence Thomas, who said that the Supreme Court should block it. But ultimately tonight, the committee very soon is going to get some very critical information pertaining to January 6th that are documents of the former president, Tom.
And Leanne, there's a little bit that we know about this and a lot we don't know. So as you said, 700 documents. It stands to reason this centers around the time of January 6th or around there. But do we know any more about the documents? And does the former president, does he have any options left?
We don't know a lot. We do know that there are some communications between the former president and the Department of Justice, and those are very intriguing to this January 6th Select Committee. As far as the road forward, this is the end of the road for the former president on those documents. But this committee does say that there could be more tranches of documents that they're going to ask for, and we'll see how the courts deal with that down the road. And as far as if the public is going to see these documents, not immediately. The public will not see these probably until the January 6th committee completes its work, and that could be months from now, Tom.
Leanne Caldwell for us tonight. Leanne, we thank you for that. Next tonight, to those new details out of the New York Attorney General's office on the investigation into former President Trump. The new report saying her office has found significant evidence suggesting fraud. Gabe Gutierrez has the latest.
New York's Attorney General Letitia James says former President Trump and two of his children were in charge of the Trump Organization when misleading financial statements were issued to lenders and the federal government. We have uncovered significant evidence, she writes, that suggests Donald J. Trump and the Trump Organization falsely and fraudulently valued multiple assets for economic benefit. For example, the filing points to financial statements that suggest the value of the former president's New York City apartment in Trump Tower was based on an assertion it was 30,000 square feet. These documents allege it was closer to 11,000, overvalued by about $200 million. It's a civil investigation, not criminal.
Generally, a criminal investigation requires a much higher standard of proof to show that you violated criminal laws rather than civil laws. And of course, in a criminal investigation, there's exposure to prison time, not just to fines.
The new filing is in response to legal efforts by the former president to quash a series of subpoenas against him and his family.
It's a political persecution.
Today, the Trump Organization fired back, saying Letitia James defrauded New Yorkers by basing her entire candidacy on a promise to get Trump at all costs without having seen a shred of evidence. Her allegations are baseless and will be vigorously defended.
All right, Gabe joins us now from outside Trump Tower in Midtown. Now, Gabe, we just heard there from the Trump Organization. I know we're also getting statements tonight from Don Jr. and Ivanka.
Yeah, that's right, Tom. That attorney echoing the sentiments you just heard in the previous statement and also accusing Letitia James, a Democrat, of repeatedly targeting the Trump family. Meanwhile, James herself says her office has not yet decided whether the evidence merits legal action. And again, Tom, this is a civil case.
All right, Gabe, thank you for that. For more on that report, let's bring in former New York federal and state prosecutor and NBC legal analyst Tali Farhadian-Weinstein. Tali, thanks so much for joining Top Story tonight. I saw you there in Gabe's report. You saw how he mentioned in the piece the example of the Trumps overvaluing the former president's New York City apartment. If that is just one example of a pattern of behavior, how big of a deal is it?
It's a pretty big deal, and let's put it in some context. The filing that the AG made goes through 6 different properties and Trump's brand, and says that for all of those, he inflated the value. He puffed up the value of these assets in order to get favorable terms on his loans and insurance claims. And that one really jumped out at me, the one about his apartment, because for some of the other properties, he might argue, well, there's an art, not just a science and valuation, and that some of this is innocent exaggeration. There might be different things you look to figure out the value of real estate. But it does seem pretty brazen to turn a 30,000 square foot apartment into a 10,000 square foot apartment and say it's worth a whole lot more than it actually is.
The headline in this report is that the investigation found, quote, significant evidence that suggests fraud. At what point does this stop being a civil case and possibly start turning into a criminal one?
Well, it's not that the civil case turns into a criminal case, because the civil case is running parallel to a criminal case that is principally being brought by the Manhattan DA's office rather than the New York State AG's office that brought this civil case. But of course, the evidence that is accumulated inside of the civil case can be useful to prosecutors. And importantly, and the Trump defendants have focused on this, they are at risk of saying things in the course of these depositions that might incriminate them and expose them to criminal liability.
Okay, Tali, always great to have you. We thank you for your analysis. Next tonight, to newly declassified video of a failed U.S. drone strike in Afghanistan last August. You may remember this. American forces mistaking an aid worker for an ISIS-K fighter. The botched mission killing 10 civilians, including 7 children. NBC News Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kuby has more.
Tonight, the U.S. military released 3 newly declassified videos of a deadly drone strike in Kabul last August. The footage, published after the New York Times sued for the release, shows the final moments before 10 innocent civilians were killed, including 7 children. The strike occurred in the last days of the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. 3 days earlier, an ISIS attack on Kabul airport killed 13 U.S. service members and dozens of Afghan civilians. The U.S. military was on high alert. With intelligence about an imminent attack using a white Toyota Corolla, they tracked this car, believing it was an ISIS vehicle. But the intelligence was wrong, and they were tracking the incorrect car. Driving through a congested residential neighborhood in Kabul, then seconds before the strike, what appears to be a child running into the frame. Moments later, neighbors seen frantically throwing water on the flames. Today, the U.S. military said the strike was in response to what was believed to be an imminent threat to our troops, but none of the family members killed are believed to have been connected to ISIS-K or threats to our troops, adding they deeply regret the loss of life. Ultimately, the Pentagon decided no U.S. military personnel would be punished for the tragic mistake. Courtney Kuby, NBC News, the Pentagon.
Courtney, thank you for that. Back to the president's agenda. Today, the White House said the rollout of those promised N95 masks is just days away. 400 million masks will be shipped out across the country. Here's NBC's Miguel Almaguer.
It'll be the largest deployment of personal protective equipment in U.S. history. The first of those 400 million non-surgical N95 masks should be shipped out to pharmacies and community health centers by the end of this week, allowing the first Americans to pick them up for free shortly after. but the program won't likely be up to full speed until February, after most models predict the Omicron surge will finally be behind us.
We're moving toward a time when COVID-19 won't disrupt our daily lives, where COVID-19 won't be a crisis, but something to protect against and a threat.
As it stands now, the president's plan calls for Americans to receive 3 masks per person. According to the CDC, they can be reused depending on fit, filtration, contamination, and damage. Highly effective, as the name suggests, they can filter out 95% of airborne particulates, drastically better than cloth masks. But experts concede they are uncomfortable to wear all day long.
Is there any concern that this rollout comes a little too late?
I personally would have wished it to come earlier, but, there's no better time than now.
With the Supreme Court just rejecting a request to block the federal mask mandate for air travel, governors in states like Virginia are ending mask requirements in schools.
This is a matter of individual liberty.
And while many businesses still require them indoors, in much of the country, cities like Cleveland, Memphis, Nashville, and Austin have no public mask mandates. Still tonight, the very face of the pandemic could soon look different.
All right, Miguel joins us now from Los Angeles. And Miguel, I want to pick up there where you just left off. These masks will be sent out to every state, regardless of their specific mask mandates. And these masks are coming at a time where Omicron cases are slowing down in some parts of the country, but not in others.
Yeah, that's right, Tom. These masks will be sent all the way across the country, so anyone who lives in any state will be able to get one. We're told that every American will qualify for 3 masks. And as you mentioned, in cities like Chicago, COVID cases seem to have peaked, but they're still rising in states like California out west. So these masks will be needed in the months ahead. Tom?
All right, Miguel, thank you. In California, police have released surveillance video of a suspect wanted for the deadly stabbing of a young woman. Her father making an emotional plea against this latest rash of violent attacks. An increase of crime being seen from coast to coast, leaving residents on edge. NBC's Priscilla Thompson with the latest details.
Tonight, an urgent manhunt underway for the person suspected of murdering a 24-year-old graduate student in Los Angeles.
This individual responsible for this vicious, senseless, and brutal crime, it walks amongst us. I am convinced of that.
Overnight, the LAPD releasing surveillance video appearing to show the suspect, 31-year-old Sean Smith, at a nearby convenience store. Police say just 30 minutes after the deadly attack. UCLA student Brianna Coofer was working alone at a high-end furniture store last Thursday when police say Smith walked in and stabbed her in broad daylight.
This appears to be a random act. There was nothing taken and no other suggestion of any other crime.
According to police, Cooper texted a friend just before the fatal encounter, saying someone in the store was giving her a, quote, bad vibe. Her father now struggling to make sense of it.
It's just ripped away, and it's just not right. And these things, we have to put a stop to this.
That kind of pain also being felt in New York City, where earlier this month, police say a 19-year-old was shot and killed during an armed robbery at a Harlem Burger King where she worked.
She wanted to work, get money to get a car. She wanted to go to college.
In 2020, the U.S. saw the biggest spike in murders since the FBI began tracking the data. While not as extreme last year, the disturbing trend has continued, with homicides in many major cities increasing again. In both New York City and Los Angeles, the murder rate up more than 50% since 2019.
Just this weekend here in Times Square, a woman died after being pushed in front of an oncoming train, an attack that police say was without warning and unprovoked.
A vigil held Tuesday night. The family of 40-year-old Michelle Go telling NBC News her life was taken too soon in a senseless act of violence, and we pray that she gets the justice she deserves. The 61-year-old man accused of killing her now in custody.
What'd you do? Did you push the woman on the tracks?
Yeah, because I'm God. Yes, I did.
Why?
What'd you do? God.
Why?
The horrific death prompting New York City's mayor to promise action.
We must deal with the real crime that's on underground, but we also must make people feel that they're safe underground as well.
Everyday New Yorkers concerned but not surprised.
How safe do you feel here?
I feel safe. Although I have to say that these days on the subway platforms, I'm a little more observant than I used to be.
I try to stay aware of my surroundings and, keep a watchful eye and stand behind the
the pillar and, ground myself.
There's like so many people here, like anything could happen.
Okay, Priscilla joins us now live from Manhattan. Priscilla, we can see that crowd gathering there behind you. We know police are still searching for the man accused of that heinous killing in L.A. What's the mood like there in East Harlem, and what's the latest on that murder investigation?
Well, Tom, still an outpouring of emotions and remembrance here. Much of the crowd behind me is actually the 19-year-old victim's family and friends just coming just a short while ago to lay more flowers and balloons for her. As for that investigation, 30-year-old Winston Glenn has been arrested and charged with murder and robbery in this case. He has not yet entered a plea, but the family says that it does offer some relief even amid so much grief here. Tom?
All right, Priscilla, we thank you for that. Still ahead tonight, school shooting manhunt. A 15-year-old shot while sitting in a school van in Pittsburgh. And in Florida, police releasing new details about what led up to a shooting at a high school there. Plus the fiery rescue, the moment an officer races towards a burning car to pull out an unconscious driver. And Britney's battles, why the pop star is bringing her father back to court and the legal action she's taking against her own famous sister. Stay with us. Top story. It's just getting started. We're back now with Britney Spears' ongoing legal battles. The pop star's lawyer today alleging her father, Jamie Spears, took millions from her during the now terminated conservatorship. Britney's attorney also serving her sister with a cease and desist letter over her latest book. Steve Patterson reports.
Tonight, Britney Spears filing a new motion against her father and former conservator, Jamie Spears. The pop star's new filing, claiming her father took more than $6 million as conservator, approved more than $30 million in fees, and authorized Spears' former manager Lou Taylor's personal legal fees to be paid by Britney's estate. Britney's attorney Matthew Rosengart writing, Mr. Spears has stated that he loves his daughter, but this is not what a father who loves his daughter does.
What the attorney is looking for is for the money that was taken to be paid back. But the problem with that is that this has been going on for so many years.
The filing also alleges Jamie Spears ran a surveillance program on Britney, capturing conversations with her attorney and placing a secret listening device in her bedroom through early 2021. Allegations that were first made public in a New York Times documentary.
Britney could not have someone in the privacy of her house without those three people knowing.
An attorney for Jamie Spears insisted he operated within the parameters set by the court. The singer also making headlines over her sister Jamie Lynn Spears' newest book, Things I Should Have Said, in which her sister calls her erratic, paranoid, and spiraling. Britney's lawyer sending her sister a cease and desist letter demanding Jamie Lynn stop derogatorily referencing Britney while promoting her new book, saying in part, Britney will no longer be bullied by her father or anyone else. That 13-year conservatorship coming to an end late last year after a judge ruled an end to the court-mandated control of Britney's personal and financial life. Legal experts saying that while the conservatorship is over, Britney's legal and personal disputes aren't just yet.
These legal battles, what it's doing is opening up closed wounds already. That's what it's doing. What I do see is that someone needs to open a criminal investigation as to what happened in this conservatorship.
All right, Steve Patterson joins us now from L.A. Steve, what more do we know about the status of any investigation into those surveillance allegations?
So, Tom, court documents show a former FBI special agent has corroborated the singer's claims that she was secretly spied upon by her own father and that those actions could lead to criminal prosecution. But so far, nothing has been made public on the status of any investigation. So at least for now, it's a wait and see. Tom?
All right, Steve Patterson, great to see you back here on Top Story. When we come back, the bear attack. A woman in Florida chased down by a black bear while walking her dog, how her neighbors helped save her life. And the first images from the ground in Tonga after an eruption and tsunami, plus the oil spill in Peru blamed on the eruption thousands of miles away. Stay with us. Now to Top Stories news feed, and we begin with the manhunt after a shooting outside of a Pittsburgh high school. Police say a 15-year-old was shot twice in the chest while sitting in a school van this afternoon. The victim is in critical condition. Authorities searching for at least 2 people. Hours earlier in Florida, a 16-year-old student was shot by his classmate 3 times at a high school outside of Orlando. The victim is expected to survive, and the suspect is in custody. Authorities say it stemmed from a fight over a girl. Now to the woman in Florida surviving a bear attack. New body cam footage shows the woman covered in wounds after she was chased down by a black bear and pinned. The woman had been walking her dogs at the time. Her neighbors came outside and began yelling when the bear and its cubs ran back into the woods. She's expected to be okay. That bear was euthanized. All right, next to the fiery rescue caught on camera in Texas, new body cam footage shows a San Antonio police officer running towards a burning car to save an unconscious driver. The officer attempts to use a fire extinguisher, but then reaches into the car to pull the woman out. Police believe distracted driving caused the crash. Both the officer and the driver are okay. All right, the white former Chicago police officer convicted in the fatal shooting of Laquan McDonald will be released from prison next month. Jason Van Dyke has served less than half of his 81-month sentence. Body cam footage from 2014 shows Van Dyke shooting the black teenager 16 times, including while he was on the ground. His death sparked a mass protest in Chicago and around the country. He was eligible to have his sentence cut in half for good behavior. All right, and rapper Cardi B will cover funeral costs for the victims of a Bronx fire that killed 17 people. City officials announced the Bronx native committed to paying all costs, including the transportation of victims being buried in Gambia. An electric space heater sparked that blaze that tore through the apartment building earlier this month. Turning now to Money Talks, what consumers and investors need to know from the business world and beyond. On the eve of President Biden's 1 year in office, he touted his accomplishments in handling the crisis his administration inherited. It's been a roller coaster year with signs of economic recovery alongside record inflation. CNBC senior White House correspondent Kayla Tausche joins us now. So, Kayla, give us the report card when it comes to the economy and the president's first year in office.
Well, Tom, perhaps unsurprisingly, the report card and the grade the president receives depends on who you ask. CNBC and Change Research conducted a poll in recent weeks where President Biden from Democrats received B's and C's on most economic issues, but from Republicans, he got D's and F's. Certainly, there are some bright spots, what the president touched on today. Economic growth, job creation, and certainly the stock market touching recent highs. But there are fissures, too. Retail sales, consumer confidence have slumped after soaring initially out of the gate based on that stimulus. And then, of course, there is rampant inflation, which voters are increasingly saying, fix this before anything else.
There was a term we were using a lot last year when it came to inflation, and it was transitory, because this was the spin coming from the White House and from President Biden that inflation wasn't going to be here to stay. It sounds like it is here to stay, and it's getting even worse than we thought. How did this happen?
Well, I've talked to some administration officials about exactly what was going on behind the scenes and why it appears that they were a little late to start acknowledging that inflation was present and was not temporary. Now, I've heard a few different reasons for why that happened based on the officials that I've spoken to. Some say the administration took too many cues from the Federal Reserve, which has the main goal of keeping inflation in check. They, of course, have called inflation transitory, and it wasn't until December, November that the Federal Reserve and then the Treasury Department and the White House in response started acknowledging that it could be here until later in 2022. Then there was also a deep desire by officials who served with Biden when he was vice president to put more rocket fuel underneath this recovery. They feel that the recovery in 2009 wasn't strong enough and that Mr. Biden didn't get enough credit for that. And then finally, I've also heard that there was so much focus this time last year on staving off a worst case economic scenario, 10% unemployment, really depression-like scenarios, that they were focused on getting businesses open and getting people vaccinated, and they weren't thinking about risks like inflation popping up, Tom.
Kayla, briefly, is there enough time to get the economy on track? And I know it's not all doom and gloom on the economy, on the economic side. The markets seem to be on a roller coaster, but with the Fed raising rates, what type of optimism is there out there in the financial world?
Well, I think in a few weeks, we're going to start hearing more from corporate America about what their outlook is on the economy, and that will be really indicative of where we'll go. There was one thing that some companies may take note of that President Biden said today, and that is his desire to remove some tariffs. Big business has said that that is one of the reasons why they're having to pass on higher costs to shoppers and consumers, and if those get removed, they believe they could lower prices too. Tom?
All right, Kayla Tausche for us tonight. Kayla, thank you. Coming up, the global outrage. Really strange. Hong Kong euthanizing thousands of hamsters and telling citizens to turn their pets in. We'll explain when we come right back. Back now with the Americas, focusing on stories from the U.S. and Latin America. And we turn to Colombia tonight, where a 14-year-old activist was murdered. The victim was fatally shot while on patrol with an unarmed group of volunteers who protect indigenous lands. Volunteers also were killed there. Authorities blaming rebels for the attack. New data out of Colombia shows 145 activists were killed there in 2021. Now to top stories global watch. We begin with the latest on that volcanic eruption in the Pacific. We are seeing the first images from the ground in Tonga showing the widespread devastation after a tsunami hit the island nation. Telephone lines started to reconnect today. Full internet connectivity will likely take another month or longer. And in Peru, massive waves triggered from that eruption hitting an oil refinery. Nearly 6,000 barrels of oil spilled, polluting beaches and killing birds. An investigation has now been opened. Global outrage after Hong Kong euthanized thousands of rodents and small animals over COVID-19 fears. Video shows workers in hazmat suits removing hamsters, rabbits, guinea pigs, and chinchillas from a pet store. Officials say an employee and a dozen animals tested positive for the virus. All pet stores have been ordered to turn over or put down their hamsters despite test results. Citizens who bought one in the weeks before Christmas ordered to do the same. And French actor Gaspard Ulliel has died in a skiing accident. The award-winning actor, known for several films including Hannibal Rising, he also stars in Marvel's new Moon Knight film, which will be released later this year. Officials say the 37-year-old crashed into another skier in the French Alps and suffered a serious brain injury. He later died at the hospital. When we come back, remembering Lucia Harris, the pioneering basketball star who would become the first black woman inducted to the Basketball Hall of Fame. Up next, a look back at her incredible career and the tributes pouring in tonight. Finally tonight, we want to pay tribute to basketball trailblazer Lucia Harris, who has died at the age of 66. She was a medal-winning Olympian, a three-time college national champion, and the only woman ever officially drafted by an NBA team. Here's just a bit of her incredible story. At 6'3", center Lucia Harris towered over the competition and broke barriers in women's basketball. But you'd never know that just by talking to her.
Given the fact that she's one of the most important and accomplished athletes of the 20th century, Lucy was remarkably humble.
That's Ben Proudfoot, a documentary filmmaker. His film, The Queen of Basketball, was released last year and highlights Lucy's career and accomplishments.
At one time was the greatest in the United States.
The daughter of sharecroppers, Lucia Harris attended Delta State University, propelling her team to 3 straight national titles at a time before basketball scholarships were offered to women.
I was just like a regular student at Delta. I received financial aid just like a regular student would receive financial aid.
But she was not just a regular student. Lucia joined the 1976 U.S. Olympic team and was the first player ever to score in a women's Olympic basketball game.
We played Japan, the very first game. They shot the first basket, but they missed. Came back down the court. Ann Myers passed me the ball. I shot it and made it.
After winning a silver medal, Harris returned to the U.S. and became the only woman drafted by an NBA team.
You were a 13-round draft choice from the New Orleans Jazz, a pro basketball team. You didn't take the offer. Why not?
No, I didn't think first that they were serious.
You know, that opportunity to continue to play just wasn't there for her because she was a woman. And I think anybody can look at that and see how deeply unfair and tragic that loss is, not only for her, but for all of us.
I wanted to keep playing, but there was no place to go. There was no WNBA when I came along.
across the basketball community an outpouring of recognition for Harris's accomplishments. Four-time Olympic gold medalist and 2020 Team USA women's basketball coach Dawn Staley tweeting, "All of the women's basketball community mourn the passing of our trailblazer, our queen, Lucia Harris." And we want to thank the filmmakers behind the documentary, The Queen of Basketball, for their help with sharing Lucia's story. Thank you so much for watching Top Story tonight. I'm Tom Llamas in New York. I'll see you right back here tomorrow. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.